Welcome to episode 4 of the Islamophobia Files podcast, where we explore how anti Muslim racism shapes societies at the level of law, policy, culture, and everyday life. I'm Dr. Hatem Bazian, and today's conversation titled Provo Politics and Decolonial Critiques, Quran Burning and the Architecture of Islamophobia. We are joined today by two remarkable scholars, two friends, two colleagues. Professor Mattias Gardell from Uppsala University. He's a leader researcher on religion, racism, and extremism, whose work has traced the rise of far-right movements in Europe and their use of provocative political performances. And I know Mattias, we've been trying to get him with full video, but we only have his audio. So hopefully he'll join us with the audio. Our second guest, dear friend, Professor Salman Sayyid from Leeds University. He's an internationally recognized scholar of decolonial thought and political theory, whose analysis of Islamophobia emphasizes how it is embedded in global structures of power, policy, and ideology. In this episode, we'll explore how provocative acts like Quran burnings are not just isolated spectacles, but deliberate political performances designed to provoke, mobilize, and normalize anti-Muslim sentiments. At the same time, we'll step back to consider the broader architecture of Islamophobia, the ways in which the exclusionary narratives, laws, and institutions reinforce and legitimize these acts. Together, Professor Gardell and Sayyid will help us unpack how grassroots provocations, state power intersect, and how spectacle and structure reinforces each other in the politics of Islamophobia. Welcome and assalamu alaikum. So let's start for both of you a question. When we see the Quran burning in the news, it's often gets framed as a matter of free speech, an individual isolated provocation incident. But how should we understand these acts beyond the surface level narratives, and what is taking place at the political, at the social, at the discourse level? So it's both of you. So maybe Salman, you could start us with this conversation.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. I think there are a couple of things about that. Firstly, I think when you have the Quran burnings, there's also not just a provocation, there's an intimidatory actual element to it. Because part of it is to stake out a particular action as which is going to be an affront of being threatening or bullying, etc. And I think that's a really important element of it. So it is that you are destroying something that we know that you feel attached to, and therefore it is no better than actually any kind of harassment. So it is a harassment. Now, what is interesting about this, that as you know, it occurs with a typical inversion, that the bullying and the harassment, the one who's actually doing the act, then say that they are actually defending themselves. So, and they are in self-defense. And of course, this is when you trot out all these things about freedom of expression and all of that. And I would say to you that, given that we're talking about this issue in the light of a live stream genocide, where the governments of the West have broken every law and made some new ones to allow them not to keep to their commitments about freedom of expression, etc., it doesn't really make any sense to see this anymore as an issue of freedom of expression. It never was an issue of freedom of expression. It was always an issue of intimidation and threatening behavior towards Muslim minorities in many places.
And can you hear me?
We can hear you loud and clear.
And you can also see me.
We can, but your voice is coming clear. So
Okay.
go ahead and get us on the question.
And speaking oddities, when I logged into this, it was suddenly casting a lot of streaming from public live stream unburnings in Sweden and conversations with Polygon. So something is absolutely wrong with this feed itself. No. So enough about that. But stop me if I'm just going about, because it's very hard to understand how much you speak or what kind of reactions you got when you don't see yourself. Okay, so I think that your question there, it's very context dependent. It matters where the Quran burning takes place and by whom. Who is burning the Quran in front of what and for what stated purpose. So it hasn't any given one meaning. And when it's happening in Europe and the modern nation states of Europe, I think it's a repetition of the birth of the modern nation state and of Europe as the name of a political entity that was established through excluding the Jew and the Muslim, and actually inaugurated by public Torah burnings and Quran burnings in Spain. So it's a cleansing by fire that seeks to call into place a new reconquista, if you want, to communicate a message that people that the Quran is evil, and the people that the burnings associate with the Quran, irrespective of if Muslims actually do read, are practicing or not, have no place in Europe. So it's a cleansing by fire, symbolizing an exorcism, a desire to re-establish what we know as not an historical fact, a nation state and a Europe without Muslims and without Islam. And of course, this is contrary to everything we know. We know that Islam has been one of Europe's many discursive structures or religions or what faith communities, whatever you want to call them. And Muslims have been part of Europe. If you look at Europe not as a political entity or the naming of a political entity at the birth of modernity, in early modernity, but if you look at Europe as a place of living, as a geographic entity, there's always been Muslims far longer than others. So it depends on where the burning takes place.
Now there
and
is
it's obvious that it is not. You know, I've been doing a lot of ethnographies, been talking to some of the most influential Quran burners, and we can come back to that. But in Swedish media and some of media, the reactions to the public Quran burnings are emphasizing the otherness of Muslims. But it's very easy to figure out. If you have if you would burn the Christian Bible in front of a Christian Coptic church in Cairo, it would be a very clear message: get out of here. So if you burn the Quran, it's the same. We want to rid society of the evil it's held to represent, which, according to historical experience, often has meant the people associated with the condemned works. This has been going on, for half a millennium in Europe.
Maybe we could just step a little bit back. Part of the conversation we want to have is there's the whole discussions about how we understand Islamophobia, what its components, because the discussions about religion in general assume the normative universal is Christianity and Christian place in civil society. So maybe, Salman, how do you understand Islamophobia as it relates to the Quran burning, to desecration of religious symbols, sites, and institutions, both from historical but also in the contemporary period, relative to defining and understanding Islamophobia?
Well, Hatem, I want to agree with Mattias in a sense that, and yourself, that one of the problems we have is our understanding of religion is basically a understanding of Christianity's understanding of itself as a religion. So Christianity has become a template of what a religion is. And this happens even in among so-called secularists, or what I prefer to call post-Christians, that what a religion is the Enlightenment reading of Christianity. As a consequence, nearly everything else is somehow a defective religion, whether it's Islam, Judaism, Hinduism, Buddhism, etc. And we don't actually know how to deal with them except through this category of the 19th century world religions, where you decide there were 14 religions which are world religion, and they all have something in common. And what they have in common is that they are in various ways can be linked into what Christian understanding of what religion is. Now, the trouble with that is it tries to move the debate around Islamophobia away from the questions of racism to questions of theological dispute. And in many ways, the justification for burning the Quran often takes the line of, well, the Quran is a very, as Mattias said, a very evil book, or it's a book that is wrong, it's flawed, etc., etc. Theological dispute or theological disagreement doesn't take place through burning of the Quran or burning of other books. And in fact, this is when you get the idea, well, if we have interfaith dialogue, that will resolve all our problems. But the dispute is not a religious dispute. Very few people right now are worried about the nature of the Trinity versus Tawheed. That isn't something that animates much of the tension or conflict that we see. So I think it is important to see that as a distraction, because by reframing Islamophobia as something to do with religion, what you do is reincorporate it into the kind of sensibility that Europe has itself of its own history, that it liberated itself from religious dogma, and therefore Islam represents religious dogma, and part of the struggle for liberation must be to try and liberate Muslims, especially Muslim women, but not only, from religious dogma. And we then end up having this conflict about religion and whatever that may be. Whereas, as you know, in my work, more and more, I tend to think about Islamism as a type of racism.
And you mean Islamophobia, not Islam.
Islamophobia, sorry, it's Islamophobia. Yes, Islamophobia as a type of racism. And I think what that means is that racism itself should be understood not as a type of attitudes, but a form of regulation, a form of governance, of governmentality. That racism is actually not so much whether someone thinks this or that, but how society regulates in relation to racialized bodies, in relation to the difference between what it considers to be European and what it considers to be non-European. And that difference between Europeanness and non-Europeanness becomes a defining feature of racial logics. And therefore, for me, if we understand Islamophobia as a type of racism, then I think we are much closer to understanding how the Quran burning works as a racist act. It is no different than, for example, burning a house or burning refugee hostels or taking out any kind of action against, which we understand from, burning of black churches, for example. There were not theological disputes because the people who burned were also Christians.
The KKK burning of the cross is specifically a form of political taunting in the public space and racist attack. But why do we don't see the same type of treatment relative to Muslims in here? And you're touching on this structure of racism.
Well, I think the issue really is because racism isn't just about what happens, it's also about what can be known to be happening. And I think that's really critical, because we have to remember, when did the KKK become racist? Or more importantly, when did the KKK become acknowledged as what they were doing was being as something problematic? And it's very, very late. I mean, you know, we know that from polling evidence that up to the speech of Martin Luther King in Washington, majority of the people thought that African Americans were demanding too much. A majority of white Americans were not in favor. It's only subsequently they became all in favor of Martin Luther King. So part of it is also epistemological or a problem of knowledge that what counts as racism. To give you another example, if you're a person of color working in any kind of organization, let's say a university, for example, most of the time that you will encounter racism isn't going to be the type of the burning cross variety. It's not going to be attacked. It's going to be something small, relatively looks like small scale. And the problem you have is being able to demonstrate to others that this is racism is occurring. And the language, for example, of racist incident means that unless there's an incident, it's not considered racism. Whereas we know that there's racist weathering, which goes on all the time. So the problem then becomes of how we identify racism, and that in itself then becomes a struggle of what determines what is racist or not. So we live in a world now, everyone agrees that racism is bad, and there should be and there shouldn't be any racism, except that we know racism exists, even though there's nobody who's a racist. And in fact, it's worse to call someone a racist than to actually identify racism.
Yes.
So, Mattias, you have interviewed some of the individuals that were involved in
Yes.
Quran burning.
Yes.
So, what, some of the questions you posed to them, what was the responses, and how did you navigate this?
Okay, thank you for that question. I would just quick comment to Salman. I absolutely agree. I've been developing a definition of racism as a technology to produce a human difference and an unequal distribution of status, resources, vulnerabilities among a population that's categorized as belonging to various types, sometimes called races or nations or ethnicities or religions or whatnot. So if you look at racism as a mode of production in the Foucauldian sense, I think you come much closer to what racism is. It cannot be defined, in terms of ideas or ignorance or prejudice, but it's not sufficient to look at it either as only practice and theory. So it's more that it's a technology, I would say. And going back to the first question, yes, I think that racism, if you look at it that way, is constitutive to the modern nation state, woven into the very fabric of modernity and the nation states. And when it's challenged the way that Salman describes, absolutely, I think correctly, that it has now been associated with immorality or unethical standards, and everybody takes exception for racism, they misread racism along the lines that UNESCO pointed out to us, that seeks to restrict racism to the idea of biological race. Racism, I think it's important to recognize, came introduced as a technology way before biology. Natural science is 500 years old, and what the Quran burnings do, and when I talk, to them, is try to use a technique to calling forth the racism, and including then Islamophobia as a form of racism, anti-Jewish racism, anti-black, depends on where, so, and they are conflicted with each other, but calling forth racist sentiments again to regain a influence. If you look at for instance, in Sweden, I don't know whom I'm talking to and how much you know about Sweden. But going back to the first thing, saying that it all depends on where the Quran is burning, burnt by whom, who's the public, who's the audience, to what kind of population. If you look at the Quran burnings, more than 100 instigated by Rasmus Paludan, who is a Danish, very often presented as a clown, but is in fact a lawyer and a far right anti-Muslim fascists that calls for a new Reconquista, explicitly wanting to denigrate Muslims, to put in motion a chain reaction that would be favorable for two aims. One, banning Islam. Two, ridding society of all people with a Muslim background. And he has been very, very successful in doing exactly that, calling himself Sweden's most important political influencer. And what he did by using public Quran burnings as a sort of performance is nothing new, really, but was a version that's called Provo politics that was developed in the United States in the 70s. After the first you have fascism, post 45, and then you had the loss of white supremacy in the US, and you had a lot of white racist people realizing that we had all the powers in our hand and lost it. And are you still on? Yes.
Yes, we are still.
So in that society, they try to wrestle with or come to terms with or being not racist. It still existed a lot of racial inequalities and frustrations and all of that. And what they sought to do was inspired by what we are associating with the leftist provocation politics, but they did it from a white racist perspective. So they would go in to a black inner city area, ghetto in LA, use racist provocations, killing a black person, doing a slogan, waiting for the reaction, hoping to get it exploded. That would scare a lot of white people, and it would turn, they thought, the mechanism of racial war going. That technique, that provocation technique, eventually moved also to Europe, came to inform the series of lone wolf race warriors that have the theory that the white people throughout Europe and the United States are sleeping, while the country is taken over by this wave of black and brown, Muslim, non-European, non-Christian people. White people are weak. They are misled into to believe that racism does not exist, that all cultures are equal, that we should have a gender-based equality, and all of that thing that's gonna kill white people. So they think they are living in times of a white genocide. So to repel that, they use violence as a sort of alarm clock. So you have all these people going in, it's leaderless resistance because they have figured out that the police, the intelligence service, anti-racist organizations, a lot of researchers are moving into the visible expressions of white organized racism, into the organizations that are very small, typically dysfunctional, all the KKKs, all the Nazi parties, all people are too openly racist, very easy to infiltrate, very easy to put in jail, take down. But you should be, working leaderless, decentralized, not flagged with your opinions until you hit the mosque. a church, a supermarket, a public square, and just randomly kill whoever is there. The more shocking and brutal the violence, the better. In order to try to work with the contradictions that's inherited into a system that basically is racist, but denies its racism and produces those frustrations that is so easily turned to fire in a French banlieue, in a black inner city ghetto, in the Swedish areas that's called areas of exteriority, low income, low status areas with a lot of people with so-called migration background or Muslim identities already being so frustrated by life in Sweden that poses itself of being beyond race when it's not, because we have all the statistics that shows if you have a Muslim name, you cannot, get a job and merit according to your qualifications in competition with people that carries no Muslim name, in neutral and so. You have in Sweden a situation where 59% of all mosques have been attacked, many of them by fire, being burned, and there's no outrage. It's been normalized. So you have all these kinds of sentiments going on, and a lot of people who just are ready to explode. And Paludan is not an idiot. He knows exactly how to turn all these frustrations into the riot he also saw, and that made a lot of people in Sweden suddenly voting for radical nationalist alternative, including a Swedish radical nationalist party with quite explicit Nazi roots or modernized, reformed Nazi ways, that has now started to implement a lot of policies to revoke citizenship, revoke residence permits for people who are Muslim, who are participating,
so maybe Mattias,
waving with a Palestinian banner.
Yeah. This is a great layout of the landscape, and I think it's very, very important. And maybe the question that we could take for Salman is moving from the spectacle to the structure, meaning how, from a decolonial perspective, thinking of the architecture of policy, the ideology, the global governance, what is taking place at that level, because many of these that are engaging in this spectacle act, Quran burning, attacking areas and communities of color, Muslim communities, they're intending for a particular policy shift and architecture. So how do see literally from the spectacle to the architecture?
Well, I mean, I think that's a really, really important shift. And I just want to pick up on just what Mattias also said. What Mattias is describing, and very modestly as being centered in Sweden, I would say is a broader phenomenon of white revanchism. And I think the word revanchism is worth using here. It's really a question about the idea of reclaiming something that's been lost.
Yeah.
And what has been lost is really what was considered to be the 1960s, 1970s multicultural settlement, which basically tried historically to limit white power and bring about this reconfiguration of the global north or Western societies as being somehow post-racial, or at least not defined or solely by racism. That is the culture that I think all of us have grown up with, and what we expected, or what was expected to continue. Now, I think it's important to recognize that notion of revanchism, of being white revanchism, is what unifies nearly all the white nationalists in different national settings. They have the same through. I mean, Mattias mentioned white genocide. As you know, your country has just basically recognized that there's white genocide going on in South Africa, and made South African refugees, white refugees. But this thing about white genocide is, as Mattias will know, was a very old trope found once only in really, really extreme far-right circles, where they actually were systematically thinking that they wanted to make a world safe for white children, and that was what was in danger. And what we've seen is this mainstreaming of those sentiments, and that has been steadily developing across the board. Now, the other thing I want to mention, and I think this is why Islamophobia becomes critical here, that what Islamophobia does is translate that white revanchism into an ethno-nationalist revanchism, which then allows people from the Hindutva in India, the Burmese nationalists, the Han chauvinists, to basically say what is stopping our societies from becoming what they should be is the presence of Muslims. What stops the ethno-nationalist closure is the presence of Muslims, because Muslims are now a marker or representative of something that cannot be contained in that ethno-nationalist framing. And I think that's really, really important. And there are different ways of marking this out. That right now, wherever you go and whatever sins, wherever you see Islamophobia, whether you see that in a society which may have 90% of Muslim adherents, or in places like France or Austria or United States, you will see the flag of ethno-nationalism flying. There is a kind of a chain of equivalences that you can work out through vexillology, through flags. When you look at these demonstrations, for example, in January the 6th, which flags were being flown? It was, apart from the United States flag, was the Confederate flag, the Israeli flag, and the Shah of Iran's Shah of Iran's flag, basically. Similarly, when you have now demonstrations around Palestinian rights, often you will see added to that the Indian flag. So you see this configuration where there is an argument that there's a global Muslim threat which needs to be challenged. And the movement from the spectacle to the structural is that all of these kind of attempts to build a new common sense have used these kind of devices about various marches, the Quran burnings, but this has been a systemic process. We know this, that has been well documented, that these are not random talking points. It's not just someone going out and burning the Quran. It is actually part of certainly a kind of conflation of many things. And what does it lead to? It leads to a retreat on these issues. So when you start talking about, we have a threat from, let's say, immigrants and Muslims, when you have no countervailing voices challenging that, when you have every single so-called left of center government or establishment, when faced with the right, has shifted to the right in the hope of outflanking them. We've seen this in the Netherlands, we've seen this in Austria, we've seen this in the United States, we're seeing this in Britain. And they keep on moving to the right because there is no, the structural organizations which were able to underpin this multicultural settlement have been dismantled. If you think about the unions, if you think about the idea of a liberal kind of the media, in a sense, they've either been outflanked or allowed themselves to be dismantled. The universities were considered to be citadels of the defense of the settlement that came in. And what they have done, and we've seen this one by one, capitulate. And when that one by one capitulation has become a torrent of capitulation. So you have a situation where all the running is being made by those who argue for Islamophobia, those who are driven by this kind of white and ethno-nationalist revanchism. And there are very few countervailing voices in the world. Therefore, the structural elements start configuring together where you have this kind of the systematicity of it, is now interlocking, and therefore there's no political intervention to stop that happening, and therefore the machine just turns into it. And I think this is where it becomes really, really critical. And what we saw, with the capitulation of the universities is really, really interesting. Not because we all work in universities, because in a way the universities were supposed to be these kind of beacons of this liberal multicultural settlement. And they used to boast that what happened in other authoritarian states would never happen because these universities were defended by laws and charters and et cetera, et cetera. And we have seen a complete surrender of that. And we have seen that by there's hardly any university leadership which has stood for the principle of what they said universities were for. So we live in a strange world where there are no advocates left that would restrain that kind of structural shift that has basically moved that kind of debate further and further to the right.
If it's meaningful.
No, go, Mattias. Maybe if you could think about the response of
the debate.
No, go ahead.
Okay. Excuse me. The response of what?
I was trying to see if you could, in thinking about how the Quran burning, as well as the right-wing groupings that are doing this, how it actually gets to almost amplify, reinforce structural Islamophobia at law, society, but also how the media plays a role in projecting and making this as the dominant problem that needs to be confronted by society. The fact that you said, was it 53% of all the mosques in Sweden have been attacked with firearms?
59%, based on the total number of mosques and Islamic congregations with access to prayer hall facilities.
Yes.
So it's a whopping number, 6 out of 10. No, I think Salman is absolutely correct. It's about mainstreaming of the one's extreme, and it's taking place, I think, on throughout the world, and it is very structural and involves, of course, the state and the media and everything else. And I think, in my analysis, I think that this is related to two main factors combining these elements. One is the observation that we live in a world in which big chunks of the populations in all surveyed countries across not only the West but the world actually believes that their children will be worse off than themselves. The future looks predictable and bleak. We all know what the future will contain. Climate crisis, desert expansion, water shortage, forced migration, civil wars, terrorism. Who wants to go there? So you see, for the first time since modernity started, how big parts of the populations are turning their back to the idea of progress, evolution, and the future, and invest instead their desires for a better world in the past, in what Zygmunt Bauman talks about as retrotopia. And these retrotopian desires is actually it's a home field for radical nationalism and fascism that always has, looked to the future in the past and caters with visions and affects and storytellings. So it also talks to man's the emotional dimension of politics in a way that modernity is more rational based, politics really doesn't. So it's not a coincidence that you have the sudden success for Make America Great Again. In Sweden, the slogan was what make Sweden great again. You have Moody's shining India. You have all of these radical nationalist parties that talks to people. Netanyahu is no different. That seeks, the glory of the coming community through the glory, the glory of the past. And these radical nationalists have taken power across so many of our countries by an alliance with neoliberal capitalism, which is in fact oligarchs. And this we all understand is an alliance that only can be temporary. It really takes us in different directions. Radical nationalism, in the way that we in international comparative fascism studies talks about fascism as the more systemic change oriented version of radical nationalism, and this capitalism can't, it's necessary to produce more contradictions also in that system, and it will get into conflict with each other, like personified by Trump and Musk, for instance. We all knew that. So this will explode, and this will create new possibilities, of course, for even more fascist takeover, but also more possibilities for alternatives, for resistance, for all of that, because we also can go to history and see that no political kind of government that try to enforce or produce a population in their likeness based on homogeneity, on monoculturalism, it won't work. It will be it take all kinds of violence and security apparatus, and of course today with modern technology of surveillance and of counter-terrorism operations, and it's not a coincidence that this works on that structural level, across nations, religions. It invites the Saudis and some of the Emirates to join in the into the Islamophobia industry. It's something we also need to take into consideration. But of course, this will also open the ways for other ideas of how to structure society. If not, of course, this would be the apocalypse. I sort of think that modernity that was inaugurated at the threshold of the modern nation state and capitalism and modern politics, that was inaugurated at the threshold of modernity and by genocides in Iberia and the New World, may go out with the genocide that's now in the global eye for everyone. Maybe, but we cannot foresee now what would a postmodern world or society really looks like. If we by postmodern don't mean this gesture within literature or arts, but more seriously postmodern, we cannot foresee that really yet. But it's either gonna that or it will be the apocalypse with the great A, I think.
Yeah, well, I think it's both Salman and Mattias. You took us to the next section, which is looking from intersections and global dynamics in terms of the loss of economic standing, using scapegoating as a larger theme, because again, I say if your car breaks down, most likely it's a Muslim in the engine. So all these elements that we are seeing. And the response has been to institute Muslim bans, to build bigger walls, have politics of silence, exclusion, a shift to the right until you get to the cliff and you drop, a clash of civilization. So in thinking on these terms, how to begin to actually think in the global context about Islamophobia and the positionality of Muslims, specifically in here, and connecting it in the way that you both have been able to do so. So, Salman, if you want to jump on this.
Sure. I think it's worth just picking up the point that you mentioned earlier about the relationship between the spectacle and the structural. So if we think about an anatomy of a spectacle or event, what has happened is that if you had just a spectacle, one Quran burning, it's there and it disappears very quickly. No one knows about it. What we see is the institutionalization of these particular acts. So in a sense, the spectacle becomes an entry point for institutionalization. It works a bit like the fashion industry. No one wears the fashions on the catwalk, but they become then spectacle what people buy in the high street, right?
Yeah.
So in a sense, that relationship between the spectacle and the institutionalization is really that kind of really, really critical. We often get distracted by the spectacle, but what is happening is the kind of the memos that are being written afterwards, how to deal with these events. And one of the most weird things is this, in a way, Trump is an incarnation of the spectacle, but a lot of the machinery that he introduces or he used was introduced by Obama or Biden. The policy between Biden and Trump regarding both Iran and Tel Aviv, there's hardly any difference. If you look at who was, question about the refugees and immigration to the United States, who was the one who began introducing deportations on a mass scale? Rather than saying, no, we're not going to do this, you start putting this framework in. Once you set up the framework for these organizations and institutions, they have a life of their own. We all know that the income tax was introduced in Britain to fight the Napoleonic Wars. And the idea was that once the War of Napoleon was over, income tax would be removed. It never really happened. Income tax has been there with us. In the same way, if you think about the formation of the CIA is formed in the Second World War. And our expectation is that once the war is over, it will be dismantled because it had no purpose. But of course, we know the contrary, So I think that movement from the spectacle to institutional is really, really important to understand, that we often get involved in the event rather than looking at the structural ways in which that event then becomes used for mobilizing resources to build institutions and organizations. So the question about how to combat Islamophobia, it becomes a critical question of our time. And I would suggest that the way to combat Islamophobia is to build counter organizations, counter institutions. It cannot be done simply through appeals. It cannot be done by just simply saying, well, Islamophobia is a bad thing and, we all agree on it. Because what we are facing is not, as Mattias mentioned already, and others have talked about this the work of Jasmine Zain or Nathan Leal about Islamophobia industry. We face a Islamophobia industry, but we are only working as a sort of cottage industry or craft people trying to deal with that, both in terms of resources and all these kind of things, and also a misunderstanding of what Islamophobia is. I mean, you and I and Mattias must have been to hundreds of events or introductions on talks about Islamophobia, where someone will start off by saying, yes, we have a problem with Islamophobia, but we have to do something about the Muslims. Not recognizing that the problem isn't the Muslims, the problem is the actual construction of the Muslims is a problem. And so the idea of Muslims have to put their house in order or Islamophobia is justified, etc., etc. And we have seen that. So I think it's really, really important that we think about the way to build counter institutions in a terrain in which is Islamophobic and which is hostile to any of these attempts and projects. And this is, the experience of France is quite telling. the French government, under a liberal president, Macron, has managed to ban many counter-racist organizations, if not all of them. And this will continue. So we are now in a strange position. Almost, it reminds me of if you read many of the accounts of the colonial encroachments, you think, don't these people know what the danger is coming? Because they're basically not aware that what is actually happening. Because we have a recolonization of large parts of this planet being attempted. Not necessarily this is not the motive behind it, but the machinery has been put in place that what it's doing is that. And we then will try and sort this out through individually, episodically. And I think that is the most important task, to recognize the global, and I don't mean global just in planetary scale, but the kind of full spectrum of the range that Islamophobia is threatened, challenges, poses. And then to build counter institutions that force it to be taken to task. We cannot just leave it to be saying, well, if we give a little bit more concessions here, then things will get better. We have tried on the so-called left for almost, I would say, nearly 30, perhaps 40 years of making these small concessions. Okay, we won't build a big wall, we just a little bit of a wall. And it's never enough. And what is happening is the kind of restructuring of the relationships between the ruled and the ruled. And that, I think, is the biggest thing, that this challenge that Islamophobia poses, that we are seeing the kind of a democratic deficit being deepened and the dismantling of people as a political agent. And Islamophobia is driving that.
Mattias, you mentioned a little bit about the neoliberal economics that is also playing. Can you think, or at least give an idea of how this neoliberal economics feeding into policy and feeding into the projection of Islamophobia and the Muslim other, maybe in Sweden as well as in Europe?
I think that in what happened in, if you want to start with Sweden, it's the neoliberal shift that actually did away with what was once the most equal society in Europe to become one of, the leading unequal societies, and that also became the most segregated society in Europe. And segregation, of course, depends on class. Rich people live in a certain area and poor people in another area. But because it co-varies with structural racism, including Islamophobia, class differences has taken on a racialized articulation or appearance. And that's very, it's very visible if you just walk these areas of that's called areas of exteriority, which to me is I don't know if you heard that expression in before in English, but it's mind-boggling. It's like islands of alienness within national territories, and this selling out of the common, what was once held by all people in Sweden, be it collective transportation or education or energy or nature. If you want, this is something when Islamophobia sort of re-entered societies after the dismantling of the Soviet Union. It became a worldwide expansion of this capitalist market system that was very favorable to the neoliberal shift that did away with pre-existing efforts to hold capitalism within certain limits and made it freely expand, uh, on the basis of the increased exploitation of man's exploitation of man and nature's resources, as if they were limitless, but they are not. So it needs, of course, for a while, but when this coup, when this came, it also came with what's called the colonial boomerang, when um, the first and second and third war borders exploded. So you had the global north and the global south, and they suddenly existed within each other. And you have the establishment of a global society defined by the fact that there is no society outside of global society.
Mm.
So the world proved to be, had physical limits. Exploitation had to as resistance. So I think the solution, therefore, also, the whole system now is global. If there is no outside, of course, it will be a renewal of political philosophies that are construed with reference to the divine, because God is the only beyond that our traditions and our language allow us to think. But if you look at what they actually have in place, if be it Hindutva or most so-called Islamist societies or whatnot, it's just another version of market capitalism. It's no real systemic change there. So what neoliberalism did was also to produce surplus populations. Surplus populations that was very, very dependent on finding whatever means to survival possible. That we know, this is just an increased way of giant exploitation that produced a new caste of the super rich. That's on a global level, a big, better off than before, sort of middle class and a sort of global working force. But you also have this fourth category of the expendables, the leftovers, those the system does not no longer need, and that, of course, can also be exploited by neoliberal forces that tries, new ways of trying to keep these under control, surviving these, feeding them off, perhaps killing them off, using the surplus population to benefit the system of growth and increase the population. But there are limits to it, so it won't work. We know that.
Maybe we could take, in just a broader term, as we're getting closer to the end of the session, we had a war on poverty in the 60s, 70s, maybe in early 80s. And now we have a war on the poor, the expendable, those who we consider to be exterior, the other, and different societies having what you call different groupings that they set up to be literally those that are expendable. In the US, Trump is using the notion of homelessness as the expendable and deploying the military into trying to clean up the city. So now the cleanup of the city becomes associated with this expendable grouping. So as we get to think in the last few minutes, what are the critical tools that we need as academics, as activists, as policy-oriented people, the people who are trying literally to reshape the public discourse? So what is at our disposal? What are things that we could use? And also what programs, communities, projects that you yourself was involved with, or you could actually also recommend to people? So, Salman, do you want to? We can't hear you. Salman, are you with us? Maybe Mattias will go to you, and then we'll come back to him. Salman is having technical difficulty.
Yes, I'm also having technical difficulties here, including not being able really to see the watch. You said we had how many minutes?
We have about 14, 15 minutes, so go ahead.
Yes. I will try not to be talking too much. I think that we're living at the end of the democratic parenthesis, the experiment with democracy. It's a very, if you look historically, novel and untried way of governing a society, and we need maybe to face that. And doing that, I think the response needs to be very decentralized and localized. So the coming community, we cannot maybe know what it will look like, but we could form already now the embryos of all the coming communities by, being by practice, by doing it, and that include, of course, finding ways of establishing continuous knowledge productions and explorations and critical thinking and all the tools that we have developed to keep that production. And if you again would be informed by history or anthropology, what's done in places not considered a normal space of thinking and doing, you'll see that all of this is characteristic to mankind. There's so many ways of doing knowledge productions and forming local communities of the common. So I think we are already doing what can be done at this stage, but we may need to be doing it a little bit on the same lines as Salman said, that we need to, if structural racism is the big story, it doesn't say that that's the only structure we have. We also have a lot of other structures to build. And I think that if they are, trying to, on various global, regional, and national levels, for sort of, closing down civil societies, closing down universities, trying to restrict, anti-racism politics. That's happening in Sweden, that's happening in France, that's happening everywhere. They're closing down mosques, they're closing down all of Muslim civil societies, all the former, it's desert, it's gone. So if they want a parallel society, okay, here you go. So we have no other alternative than to form parallel society, because I think that the statement of George Floyd is basically true also on a global level. I can't breathe. Breathing itself becomes an act of resistance. Continuing to live, being a witness to our times, will become a act of resistance. Building that archive and getting it, getting it in the hands of the new generations that will see, and they will learn by practicing and by example. I think, that's exactly what we do now. And so many good people and good groups and organizations, and you could be desperate thinking there is no resistance, or where is the left? I don't know. Where is liberalism? I can't find no liberals in Sweden, to name by name only. And democracy will also, I think, continue to live by name, like in North Korea or other democracies that still use that as the concept, because they can't figure out another way of talking politics. But it be shallowed by meaning, and so we need to build that alternative by practice. Welcome back, Salman.
Sorry, yes,
So,
I had some technical trouble.
yeah.
I just very quickly just want to add one or two things because I agree with what everything Mattias is saying, and I think one of the things that we can do is not allow the knowledge of resistances, the knowledge of the historical victories and achievements to be lost, and learn from them. So one of the prime things that I think we could do a lot from is learn from the anti-apartheid struggle. It was a 100-year-old struggle. It didn't just start with Nelson Mandela walking out of Robben Island or prison. But look at the way they structured themselves living in the under that kind of apartheid rule. And in a sense, what we have is the kind of global apartheid being effective. Initially, it would only affect Muslims. That's what's being built. We already have two-tier citizenship, where Muslims in most European countries now, though they never said like this, can lose their citizenship at the whim of a home secretary, often without any judicial review, etc. Once you have citizens who can have their citizenship revoked en masse, and those who can't, you are no longer in any shape, I would understand it, any meaningful sense of liberal democracy anyway. So I think we have to see the war, these struggles is against apartheid, and I would include Jim Crow, I would include colonial rule. What was common to them was there were forms of apartheid. And that's what we are moving towards, a soft apartheid. And a lot of the tech use of technology is reproducing apartheid. So I think learning from that struggle, seeing what had to be done, the difficulty that I think is really important. I think the mobilizations against genocide have been really, really important, and I don't think we should forget about them, because what they have done, and look at the way that they have persisted, despite the complete inability of those in power, those willing to say or do anything to stop this kind of thing. And I think what shows the existence of God is that you already have Ukraine and Palestine side by side. So you can see the racism explicitly. You can see how many tears are to be shed for one group conflict for another conflict. And that, in a sense, breaks the rubber. We are now living in a situation where the kind of pretense, the mask is off. People cannot pretend that the case that is being made for the liberal, democratic, global North or West as being the kind of savior of humanity is, something that most people in the global South were never really into, but had come to believe was that was the case. That is no longer the case. So you're quite right. You have to start thinking about building other parallel structures. You have to think about how the war against Muslimness is at this historic moment a war for the future of the planet, in which humans become less and less significant. That, in a sense, you're reshaping those issues, the question of humanity. So I think it's really, really important that we build these parallel networks, recognizing the balance of forces. That we don't have the Cold War as a Soviet Union or any other. We can't play off one superpower or the other. These are really, really difficult, but there is no other alternative. And in a sense, if we believe in things like human dignity and civil rights, etc., then you also have to believe that you need to fight against Islamophobia, because that is where Muslimness now becomes the unlikely custodians, in a sense, of some of these issues which have been abandoned. And if they're become abandoned totally, I think we will be in a very, very dark place.
Yes.
As we get into the last minute or so, can you offer some recommended readings, Mattias? And we will make sure that to include those on the links, critical your own or additional readings that you think is very important for our listeners and those who are connected to the Islamophobia files to be able to have access to. Mattias?
Mm, I would be happy to send recommended readings. I would
For sure.
I think there is so much good critical scholarship and thinking that goes on. That's so super impressive. So it's a long list. I want to, if it's possible, use that 1 minute to just
Sure.
say that I think that Palestine is key, and I think it has holds a concentration of all the struggles in itself in that very small contested area. And
Mm.
the if you look at the difference between this genocide and other genocides, contemporary or historic, I think this the different main important difference is the absolute visibility that uh, forces everyone to look at the same time, not only on the front side but also the obscure side of Western-based global order. So I think it's really an existential struggle. They write about that, and of course, from a colonial perspective, colonized perspective, everyone knows the obscure side of the system. It's been it's no they're not unused to be colonized by Western democracies that claim
Mm.
all talk about human rights and all of these things that they are denying the colonized others. That's the old story. The new story is that they're forcing the world to look at it exactly as Salman says. Look at it in the eye. This is absolutely visible, and if there's a lot of I think the efforts when we talk about scholarship. I think much is to be learned from the studies of settler colonial studies, but it has a problem that it sort of tends to focus on the successful colonial project and their elimination
Mm.
of the other that's built into settler colonialism by looking at too much Anglo-French history, too much 18th century, too much the successful stories of the United States and Australia, for instance. So it tends to distract our focus from all the examples throughout history and the world when colonial dominance failed. What about Algeria? What about South Africa? As
Mm.
Salman says, all the Ethiopia, all these places where the anti-colonial forces were resistance actually succeeded in kicking out this because it's always been very asymmetric. It's always been, the colonial powers have always had this supreme military technology that they then conflated with their racial superiority and all of that. So that was not the difference. The French was one of the big European powers, and they lost. And I think that's very important to see. And I think they're actually gonna lose Palestine as well. So it may look as absolutely hopeless, but I don't think it is. And when that fall from the hands of the colonial, the whole system that they are now attacking, the United Nations system, the human rights system, the liberal democratic order, will maybe also fall. And we don't know what comes beyond. Will it be another round of pluralism, that is the BRICS? Will that be much more interesting? Will it really be a systemic change? Or may we find another way of using that, because it's a global solidarity movement. It's also a multitude, and that's everywhere, and that's in fact I think uncontrollable, and that contains the seed to the coming community, I think.
Thank you, Mattias and Salman.
Thank you.
Do you have any recommendation material, books that you want to refer to, your own or others, for sure?
Well, I mean, I think what is necessary right now is a lot of critical work and investment in critical thinking. So what I would suggest is I would like people to contribute to the project, to be writers of it rather than just the readers of it. So I think they should be go onto the Reorient website where they can find the blogs, they can find Radio Reorient, they can also, there's ISRA, these are all these organizations, there's a there's Islamophobia studies. These are the kind of venues for creating this, building this new archive and building this new platform. I think it's useful to remember one quote from Lenin, who said there could be no revolutionary movement without revolutionary theory. And what I think this means in this current understanding is this, that it is important for us to break free from the idea that we can just, all it requires for us to work our way out of this is just one more turning up for a march. I think a lot of it requires study. It requires critical thinking. It requires connecting up these various things, as Mattias has already alluded to. So part of our work must also be, there has to be intellectual work as well as the activism, that they can have to coexist, and we have to find better ways of making them work together. There cannot be any organization without that kind of understanding of the world. And there can be no understanding of the world which is not then incarnated into particular organizations. So I think people should get involved. And in terms of find the readings, read Reorient. That's what I would say.
That brings us to the end of today's conversation. Special thanks to our guests, Professor Mattias Gardell and Professor Salman Sayyid. We have been blessed, and much gratitude for your work, for unpacking how spectacle and structure work hand in hand to sustain Islamophobia, and for reminding us that what may look like isolated provocations are deeply connected to global systems of power and policy. For our listeners, we hope this episode provided critical insights into how acts of provocations, Islamophobia, like burning Qur'ans, are not just about individuals seeking attention, but part of a broader architecture that normalizes exclusion, discrimination, and structured violence. We stay tuned for our next episode. We will continue to explore the Islamophobia files and bring new voices into the conversation. Until then, thank you for listening, and let's keep asking the difficult questions that push forward justice and understanding, and hopefully a new transformative work. Thank you. Assalamu alaikum.